This is the Left in the Forgotten Borough podcast. I'm Andrew Savage on this Taco Tuesday. And Nancy is still on her European adventure. She's back later this week, but right now I am joined by Mike Schnall, my fellow former Young Dems president and stalwart Democrat and community activist here in Staten Island. Welcome to the podcast, Mike.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting. This is my first podcast.
It is.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
surprised. Because usually anything local, whenever there's anything local happening, there's maybe five or six people that I look to see, like what they think of it and what's going on. You're one of them, so I'm surprised that
Oh,
nobody is like, saying to you, come on and share, tell us
thank you.
what you think. Yeah.
I'll let my mom know that somebody actually listens to what I have to say.
Yeah, and we have there's no shortage of things to go through today. I'm, as a history teacher and as somebody who's heard a lot about the Cuban Missile Crisis and just the tension of those few days and what that was like in the Kennedy era. I've sort of felt that over these last few days between Easter Sunday with, him talking about opening the fucking strait, you crazy bastards, and
Mm,
today talking about annihilating the civilization in Iran. And, I've seen the clips of Iranians forming human shields around bridges and infrastructure. And so if they were going to launch these attacks, they would absolutely be committing war crimes. And I just wanted to get your take on what's happening over the last few days and really this last month of this insane war that nobody wants.
yeah, I know it is a little wild to think about the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House. I mean, not that, for the last 5.5 years well, the first 4 years of his presidency and then now that it hasn't been a wild ride, but this is sort of extra, as my daughters would say. And it's up against the backdrop of this lunar mission. So you have, this president who's saying things that are so outrageous that even folks that supported him are not supportive anymore, with this incredible human accomplishment. And so it really does look even crazier when you think about what human capacity is for great achievements. And then you have this guy who literally threatens people with acts that are blatantly considered war crimes and things that just never should come out of the mouth of a president ever. The one thing that's really struck me as really interesting as a political scientist is that we unilaterally attacked a sovereign nation, and then he went to the NATO nations asking for their help. And now I don't know if you remember, but a lot of people made fun of Joe Biden for doing all the work
Yeah.
before something like this would have happened.
Yes.
Gathering friends and colleagues and, allies to get everybody on board. And that is like basic stakeholder management. And this president and his White House doesn't seem to understand that you can't go after the fact asking for help if you've never made them part of the initial process. And so that, adding on the rhetoric, adding on the complexity of things that are going on in the Strait of Hormuz, it's a wild ride.
Well, yeah, and I was listening to the Daily podcast from the New York Times yesterday, and they talked about how this war has been quite a lonely experience for Trump and for the United States, and why shouldn't it be? I mean, he spent the last year and a half almost shitting all over our allies with tariffs and with, he was gonna invade Greenland in February,
Right.
and and so why should they why should they come to our rescue now?
Yeah, well, I was listening to CNN and both MS Now, and sometimes I listen to Fox News just to get these sort of different viewpoint. And one of the former military leaders said that presidents often get seduced by sort of how easy it is to execute a plan and to be successful with it. So I think that the president saw success with the Venezuela raid on Maduro and thought, hey, maybe I can do this on other places in the world and sort of exact my revenge and also sort of force
Watch things go
change.
boom and watch things go boom. Why not?
Right, right. So I think he was seduced in a very the very simple way that a lot of the presidents have in the past, that they see success and then they think, well, what else can I do? Like, what else can I blow up? What else can I take over? And so I think he thinks he's exceptional, but I think he's just like any other person put in a position where the shock and awe of it is has seductive qualities.
Oh, absolutely. And this was this kind of getting in, not getting into these kind of forever no point wars was a core component of his campaign. And the true
Yeah.
believers like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Candace Owens and even that lunatic Alex Jones, they've all said, we're out. Marjorie Taylor Greene goes as far as calling for the 25th Amendment to be invoked.
Mhm.
And yet our representative in Congress here on Staten Island, Nicole Maliotakis, is silent. I just
Mhm.
checked. I just checked her thing because you said to, check it, see if she said anything. She's, talking about cuts or whatever. And, again, like I said, I could think of more pleasant ways to be lied to than to just look at her social media feed. But it just really those people, those lunatics, those ghouls have more moral clarity on this than she does. She has no moral clarity on anything. It was one of the many reasons why we have to vote her out.
Mhm. She's never been someone to really sort of step to the fore and take a position that's different than, whatever the GOP speaking points have been. She's, rank and file. It's all throughout her career. She also has a tendency to jump on the bandwagon when something is successful. Like she opposes it until she supports it when she sees that the polls are trending in a different way. So I'm not surprised. I mean, again, you want your elected officials to be aspirational. You want them to like be someone that you can look up to, someone who has a vision. We're just not getting that right now, especially from her.
She has no core. She has no beliefs. I mean, Elena from the Staten Island Action Coalition was on as my guest co-host a few months ago when Nancy was out, and she
Mhm.
said, we try and poke at her conscience. I said, you can't poke at what doesn't exist. I mean, she like she doesn't have any kind of moral principles or guides or anything. Um, so I just think that I just think she's just abhorrent for a number of reasons. And, this guy is threatening to blow us all into a nuclear winter. And
Mhm.
she says nothing, literally nothing.
Yeah, no, it is pretty perplexing. But
Yeah.
we do have two candidates that have qualified for the ballot, right? So Allison Zagat and Mike DeSillis.
Yes.
Uh, I don't know if you have a feeling on both or one, or you have a prediction. How you
Well,
feeling?
actually, Nancy and I have been um, reluctant to endorse publicly or anything like that. I did go to both openings for both
Good.
candidates, and each one had their own vibes. I will say about Allison's opening, though, that I did see a lot of people who I'd never met before.
Mm.
And she managed just to fill that whole space with the union electricians. And after after 16 years of going to Democratic Party events, you kind of see the same people over and over again. And so it was, a kind of a welcome change that so many new faces were there. And it's really a strong sign for electoral success in November. And I'm hoping that they create the kind of messaging and the coalition and the campaign that they did in 2018.
Yeah.
The one thing I would advise her, I see that there's, people around her telling her not to veer into divisive national issues, which I think, I totally disagree with. Why would you run for office if you're not going to talk about these things? And so I think, how I spent $70 on gas the other day, 70. And
Yeah.
I was paying less than 50 under Biden. There was a guy that was on MS Now that we showed a few episodes ago. He was like, I miss my Uncle Joe. I was balling. He said I was balling when he was around. And now there was a poll that says most Americans, 2 years too late and a dollar short, they miss Biden's economy.
Mm. It's
And
amazing to me that that is the topic that has turned people, that gas
yeah.
prices. Think about this, right? So you spent $70 to fill up your car. Maybe it was 55 before that, back during
Mhm.
Uncle Joe's time. So
Yeah.
that $15, let's say you fill up once a week. So that's $60 a month. That $60 is what's changed people's opinions entirely about somebody that had said things and done things that were so abhorrent to, two-thirds of America that issue alone has changed their minds. Then you pile on, Iran. And obviously, that's sort of like the final nail in the coffin. But it just really goes back to what Clinton used to say, right? When Bill Clinton ran for office in '92, it was the economy, stupid, right? It's literally things that affect people's wallets. And it
Yeah.
is so obvious now that, you know, this didn't have to be. It didn't have to be that gas prices went up. They were at, I remember paying a few weeks ago, 2.69 a gallon. Now it's 3.99. I mean, he has
Over
literally
four now.
caused the
Yeah.
collapse in the oil market.
Over $4 now. I'm seeing him in a lot
Yeah.
of different places. And, I think anybody who runs against Nicole Maliotakis, whether it's Allison or Mike, I think they both have to hone a message of, economic issues. Things have
Hmm.
gotten more expensive under Donald Trump. Nicole Maliotakis has cheerled every single one of these things. Again, they piss on her leg and they tell us it's raining.
Hmm.
If you look at her social media, and if you're only going by that as your one source of information, everything's great. Um, and and meanwhile, they are shielding people in the Epstein files, Pam Bondi or not. They're
Hmm.
shielding those people from any accountability at all. So none of her law and order bullshit really doesn't, stack up to what her actual record is. She can't even say, Nicole, that Ghislaine Maxwell shouldn't get a pardon. And
Hmm.
just this things are just far worse measurably across all categories. They've broken all of their promises. Wars, well, here's a war for you. Uh, I'm going to make things cheaper. Everything's more expensive. And directly related to their actions on tariffs and the war and everything else. And so I think it needs to be an economic message, but I think, she protects Nicole Maliotakis, the rest of the GOP, Donald Trump, they all protect the Epstein class. I think that has to be the phrase. These Epstein classes, those people are paying less in taxes. They are getting far more from this system than any of us certainly are. And
Hmm.
they're being shielded from accountability.
Right. I mean, going back to your point for a second about gas prices, you think about what the current mayor ran on, affordability, right? That literally affects every single individual in New York City. Affordability is the sort of single unifying theme throughout the 2025 campaigns. And now, because affordability has literally hit everyone, people are able to now then focus on other things. Like, so we know that the price, like going to the supermarket, your bill is double or triple what it used to be. You go filling up your car. So now people are saying, well, wait a second, there's these other issues like the Epstein files that I'm not hearing anything about. So yeah, you're right. It sort of all papers over some of the underlying problems that we all knew going into the new presidential administration in 2025 that other people now are starting to talk about too. You know, I if things trend the way they do, I can't not see a giant blue wave hitting in November.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
yeah,
If they
so both
don't,
Allison and Mike should figure out what is it that resonates the most with folks that are outside of their normal base. Like,
yeah.
don't take for granted Democrats, right? I
Mhm.
think Mike McMahon learned that lesson when he ran for reelection way back when. He sort of like tried to triangulate an issue and it offended Democrats and didn't bring over anybody new, and he lost. The same thing with these folks. They need to figure out what it is that really appeals to Nicole's base that she's not talking about, when there's a lot that she's not talking about.
Well, yeah, and absolutely. And I don't think they should bend over backwards the way that McMahon did when he voted against the Affordable Care Act. He voted against the Affordable Care Act and still lost.
Hmm.
I think, and Max Rose, ran ad after ad, saying how shitty Bill de Blasio was, thinking everybody was gonna, resonate there. It didn't. And so I think they have to walk the line of keeping the base happy, but also bringing people in. I don't think you'll ever get the cult. I don't think that's ever
Hmm.
happening, but get the people who they were able to peel away from us in 24. So like
Hmm.
the Hispanic men, the black men, the disaffected young men who listen to these psychos on these other podcasts, who could potentially listen to, an alternative point of view.
Right. I wonder what that size of that voting population is. Is it something? It's probably, unaffiliated voters are probably at least one third of the voting population now.
Yeah, well, I would think, even if they're registered in one party or another, unless you're really clued in the way that, people like us are, a lot of times, they don't have a strong allegiance to one or
Mm.
another. And so um, I would hope that that whoever wins our primary says to the voters, Nicole Malliotakis has cheerled for Trump. They've pissed on your leg and they've told you it's raining. That they've said everything is great, even though it's not. Look at your bills across the board, they're not. Um, and all she's done is basically taken credit for the work of other people and cut ribbons. No ribbon is safe in this town while she's in charge. And but really hasn't delivered anything else in almost 16 years of elected office. And so I'm hoping that that's the message that they go with.
Yeah, we'll see. First off, they have to do battle with each other. What do you think is
Yes.
the deciding factor there? Is it it's sort of like a labor union stalwart versus a sort of public servant who's run a few times? Which do you think plays out?
Well, I got a sense of when Mike was on the podcast a few weeks ago, I got a sense of what his line of attack would be. When I asked him about how he would distinguish himself from his opponent, he said, "Well, I never heard of her. I don't know anything about her."
Right.
So, and to say, to read into that further is to say, well, I've been out here. Where have you been
Mm,
all this time? And so I'm not really sure. I spoke to her briefly at her opening, but and she didn't mention him, but I get the sense that she's focused on the kitchen table issues. I just worry that she's going to attempt to divorce those things too much.
mm. Are you
In
going to try to get her on your podcast?
Oh, we're working on it. We're
Good.
working on it. Actually, I was just texting with the campaign manager as we're talking. So we're working on it. But I would advise her to not shy away from the big issues and not shy away from talking about who's at fault for these things.
Mm,
When she's on this podcast, I'm gonna say to her, I paid $70 for gas, and that's because of Donald Trump. That's because of Nicole Malliotakis. That's
yeah.
because of the Republicans who have enabled all of this bullshit for all this time and are too afraid to actually say this guy is a fucking lunatic and should be 25th Amendment out the door. And so, I'm going to open the door for her that way to do it because you can't divorce these things. It's these things, everything economically is measurably worse because of
Mm,
Donald Trump, because of the GOP, because of the oligarchs who benefit most from their policies. And so so I'm going to try and push her in that direction, but I just don't want her to be too milquetoast about that just to try and, not offend anybody or whatever. I just think you have to go for those things head on.
mm. Yeah. We'll see what she does.
Yeah. And so, Mike is to his credit, he's not shy about those things. He's not shy about those things. And I'm hoping, and I know she's more new to the race, but I'm hoping that she kind of connects the dots there.
Yeah. Again, we'll see. I'm looking forward to maybe a debate between the two of them.
Yeah, I would like to see that too. I would like to see that too. But we definitely have, other things going on in Staten Island. We have a big uproar on the South Shore.
Yeah.
It seems like this story kind of happens over and over and over again, no matter where it is. Oh, there's something going up. There's a homeless shelter. There's this, there's that. And people throw a fit. And, the usual arguments are made, and it's very NIMBY coded.
Mm.
And I was just wondering because you did some extra research on this. I know
Yep.
the arguments are, well, this is too far away from services that would help the people who would go into the shelter, but I'm skeptical of how authentic that is.
Yeah, so I've had a little bit of experience actually. So I'm not a housing expert and I don't know the solution to homelessness. But when I lived in Tompkinsville, probably we moved about 8 years or so to West Brighton where we live now. But in Tompkinsville at the time, there was rumblings about the potential siting of a facility at the intersection near Tompkinsville Park and Victory Boulevard. And I remember at the time, people were given notice, the community board was given notice. There was very little discussion amongst the elected officials. And the de Blasio administration, I think it was de Blasio. Yeah, de Blasio administration at the time just made the decision without any community input. And at the time, those discussions about why this was happening and what it was going to do to the community was focused in on the population that was going to be in the facility and the impacts on the surrounding community. Never did you hear that there wasn't enough social services.
Yeah.
Because on the North Shore, there's all the social services. We have everything on the North Shore. Now, I also can speak as a somebody who grew up on the South Shore in Great Kills, up until I was went to college and law school, that there was never anything that I could remember of a social service, not even like a walk-in unemployment center or just think basic things that you would think of. And over time, the South Shore has developed, right? Obviously, more developments happen, more commercial development, many more people are living down there, but there hasn't been the same movement towards government services being situated there and in the Mid Island. It's always concentrated on the North Shore, and the argument is that it's near the ferry.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. If you live on Staten Island and you need those services, you're not using the ferry. Like
No.
you're using buses, you're driving, you're taking an Uber if you can afford it. So this conversation about homeless shelters and the lack of access to services is sort of ironic because, I mean, honestly, it has to start somewhere. You have to start with something. And if you look at why it happened and how it happened, it's very simple. I would imagine that many, many years ago, Albany elected officials decided that based on a lawsuit, it's called Callahan versus Carey, the city was then required because of this lawsuit. And again, I don't know the facts of the case, but it does stand for the fact that the city has a legal obligation to house people immediately. So that means that if you become homeless and you seek the services of the city, they have to put you somewhere. And there's obviously not enough capacity. So coupling that with some rulemaking that was done in 2024, the city has basically taken away any community input on these projects because they're treated like community facilities. So again, putting on another hat that I had many years ago when I worked at New York City Parks. New York City Parks was responsible for planting 600,000 street trees throughout New York City. And you get a homeowner who would say, "Hey, I don't want this tree in front of my house. I'm a senior citizen. I can't rake up the leaves." And the city would go in and install the tree anyway. They treated the tree like it would a city infrastructure, like a hydrant or a stoplight. And now homeless facilities are being treated in the same way, is that it's not really up for debate amongst the community. Now, people think that that's like anti-democratic. They think that it's against community engagement. And I think it's an outcome, like you had mentioned earlier, that people just never say, "Hey, bring your homeless facility to my community." They never do. I've
No.
never
I've
heard of an
never,
instance.
no, I've never heard once anybody welcoming it with open arms for sure.
Yeah.
Um,
So the city's basically taken away the ability for the community to weigh in on this. They've literally made it an as of right infrastructure improvement. So there's no zoning, there's no city council vote, there's limited engagement with the community. It's exempt. They're exempt from ULURP, which is a huge sort of obstacle to any development in the city. And then in 2023, when Mayor Adams did an executive order, he suspended land use reviews for these shelters in furtherance of the migrant crisis, and that still exists today, unless Mayor Mamdani, withdraws that executive order. So, outside of the normal notification of elected officials and the community board, it pretty just much just happens. And I think I don't know much about what was said at that rally, aside from some sort of like brief video pieces that I've seen. But I think the elected officials are doing what elected officials do. They're sort of taking the temperature of their community, and they're saying the things that sort of recognize the angst in that community. But I also think that they have an obligation to also look at the current laws, that maybe go to court and fight that case, the Callahan case that I mentioned, and figure out a way around this if that's what they want to do. But you can't like they can't stop it right now. So anything that they're going to do is going to be for the future. And I guess we'll see what they're capable of doing,
Yeah, it was the whole thing just seems very NIMBY coded. The whole thing just seems kind of, like the only time I ever see Vito Fossella is when he crawls out of his rock and bitches and complains about something. That's really, and he really rarely or ever offers a solution. Rarely ever does he offer any kind of productive way forward to any of these problems. It's always just bitch, 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 moan, moan, moan. And and that was basically the entire rally that I saw. And
Mhm.
it was, and it was always, to try and sweeten the pot a little bit to make it look like they're not doing what they're doing. Well, we're concerned about the access of social services. No, you're not. You just want to move it. And I was really disappointed. And I spoke to Nancy about it because she holds him in very high regard. I was really disappointed to see Cliff Hagan there, um, just stoking these people because you could see it was, if you look out into that crowd in those videos, it was an all-white crowd. It was an all-white crowd. Um, Certainly, it just seemed as though, again, just very NIMBY coded. We don't want those people here. We don't want any of those people here.
Yeah, I
And
haven't had an opportunity to talk to Cliff yet to
yeah,
find out sort of what his strategy is or what he's thinking. I mean,
yeah,
he just ran for office against Frank
yeah.
Morano, who, as a human being, I actually do like him. He's one of the few people that we are on opposite sides on a lot of issues, and yet we seem to be able to have pretty constructive conversations without getting mad at each other.
Mhm.
So maybe Cliff has developed a relationship with Frank and feels like-minded, but I'm not sure why he took that position. I watched the clip of what he said, and there was nothing really substantive there. It was
Yeah.
just more red meat for the crowd.
Yeah, it seemed, I have my guesses. I think this is really just a raw, calculated political move, and he's welcome to come on. He's been on this show before. He's welcome to come on and tell me I'm wrong and why. But it just strikes me as somebody who is not done with electoral politics and knows where the bread is buttered in that district. And
Interesting.
and knows and I don't know, maybe it's genuine, maybe it's heartfelt, maybe he does have, serious concerns or whatever, or maybe there's something I don't know. Again, he's welcome to come on and tell me I'm wrong. But I think it just struck me as nakedly political. He was the only Democrat that I saw there. He was the only Democrat that I saw in that crowd. And so I think, and it harkened back to just kind of the vitriol I saw a few years ago at St. John's Villa and
Right.
with the migrant shelter. And I think, again, if you like you said, there are ways of dealing with that, but I think having a bunch of rabid people in the community who are already angry, yelling at 5 and 6 year olds as they enter a shelter is not going to solve anything. And it just confirms everybody's worst views of Staten Island.
Yeah. But look, I mean, to be honest, this happens all throughout the city. So we're not unique in that respect. I mean, and people tend to come out in the community when they're afraid of something that they're not sure about. I'm in West Brighton. I'm part of the Civic Association, and one of the things that we struggle with here is meeting attendance, getting people to come to meetings. And it always proves true that when you have a contentious issue that people are not happy with, whether it's the siting of a legal marijuana shop or the sighting of a drive-through or
Yeah.
you name it, whatever it is that people just don't know about or they're not sure what it's going to do or they're concerned about the potential impact, they come out to the meeting. But if you have a regular meeting that's just informational and talking about businesses and presentations by elected officials, no one shows up. And it really is a shame that people just aren't engaged unless they're afraid. It would be
Yeah.
nice to see more of that engagement on maybe more positive topics like helping to redevelop your local playground or coming out to a community board meeting just to hear about what's going on. It would be great to see people coming out in non-negative times, but I'm optimistic and maybe a little naive to think that that's still possible.
I hope so. I hope so. But they're certainly not going to be encouraged to do that by the elected officials that were there. I mean, again, they all know where the bread is buttered. in that
Mhm.
district, and it's with the fear, it's with the NIMBYism, it's with the anger, and it's with this, kind of suspicion of the unknown. And I think that uh, there are ways to have these conversations, and are you going to solve homelessness? Where are you going to put these people? And just because you don't want to see it, just because you don't want it in your face, doesn't mean that it's not there and that you don't have to confront it and deal with it somehow. And so I think this idea of, well, we're going to put it here but not there, and we don't want it there, I think that's just kind of window dressing. I think it's just they just don't want to confront the realities of poverty.
Yeah, and I think, something that I put on Facebook the other day that sort of I really thought about this was that the enemy is not the homeless person, it's homelessness. And like
Yes.
every one of us should really think deeply about how easy it is for any one of us to lose everything that we have, especially in times where medical healthcare costs are astronomical. And if God forbid you end up in the hospital and your
Yeah.
insurance doesn't cover something, you're looking at tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. People go bankrupt and broke and they lose their homes and they become homeless. And so we should all be very thankful for what we have. But I also will say this, I am not a religious person. I am Jewish by
Mhm.
birth. I went to Hebrew school. I got kicked out of class a lot for talking too much. But the things that I took
No.
away from Judaism were more about how you should treat others, like, the golden rule and things like that. And a lot of folks hide behind their religion and their faith and their belief in God and t tend to forget what it is that they were actually taught, which is to treat your neighbor with respect, help others who are in need. And Staten Island, statistically, in everything that I've ever seen, is one of the most giving, caring communities. But you wouldn't know that because that's not the stuff that the Staten Island Advance and other folks are covering. What you see is these angry, reactions to things that are scary and nerve-wracking for homeowners. But in fact, that same person at that rally who was afraid of a homeless shelter being sited in a commercial area on the deep South Shore is also the same person who's donating to charities throughout the year, giving their used clothing and furniture and their bikes and things to people who need these things. And then they go to that rally. So there's like this weird dichotomy, and like it feels strange to think that someone who would be yelling at that rally could also be a really giving person.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I've sort of gotten back in touch with my faith a little bit. I go
Hmm.
into an Episcopal church. I do their food bank and everything. And what strikes me is that the people in my church, they do the work with homeless people a lot, and they do the work with people who are in need the most. And if you asked any one of those people at that rally, they would say, "Oh yeah, we're Christians. We believe in Jesus." And
Hmm.
it's granted it's probably an Aryan capitalist Jesus, but they would cite their belief in Jesus and Christianity and everything as the guiding force in terms of everything they do. But certainly just kind of, I guess they've missed the part about welcoming the stranger.
Yeah, I mean that is the really at the end of the day, not only does the city have this legal obligation, which I discussed before, but we also have, a moral obligation to take care of those less fortunate than us. And we all can do that in however that is appropriate for each of us. And again, everybody's afraid of what they don't know. So I don't blame people for reacting this way. But the laws and the rules have evolved to sort of to tackle that problem. Hopefully we get to a point where no one needs a homeless shelter anymore, or there's no longer a need to site them. But part of what's going on with the siting of these facilities more recently is really a borough-based approach that has equity baked into it. They're trying to spread these facilities more outward into areas that have never had them before, is to sort of spread the I guess the burden of having them in communities. So, this is not going to be the last one that we see, and it's not going to be the last one where you see people coming out and rallying against it. And we'll see, the things that divide people on the political spectrum sometimes unite them too, which when you mentioned Cliff and Frank, it's an interesting like thing where these folks ran against each other, and yet on this one issue, they are united. It's very interesting to see, and you don't see it that often.
No, NIMBY is bipartisan. I always said that NIMBY is bipartisan. I remember, and as you mentioned before, it's not exclusive to Staten Island. I just remember on the Upper East Side, people were really upset about a shelter potentially going there, and they made a stink about it. And Bill de Blasio hid under his desk at the time, basically to get around having to address it.
Yeah, yeah.
And do you know of any instances? Because I know sometimes the city backs off when the opposition is loud enough. And what were some recent examples that you could think of where that's happened?
I in the last few years, I have not seen a situation where a homeless shelter was not cited under this sort of borough-based approach. I don't see any evidence of it stopping. And it'd be interesting to see if there's a different outcome here, but I doubt it. I really doubt it. I think that the between the legal precedent and the state and the rules and everything that's sort of all the mechanisms that have been suspended to fast track these, I think it's a fait accompli. But again, these folks that are taking this on the South Shore might have some impact on the future of how these are cited, and it remains to be seen. You also have a different mayoral administration. The new mayor has, talked about equity, has talked about things that other mayors haven't spoken about in the past, and the way in which certain communities have been neglected or left out. I'll be curious to see if maybe he's responsive to their pleas. I don't know. I mean, we haven't heard anything. I haven't seen any reaction from City Hall.
No, I haven't either. And although the mayor seems to be very good at threading the needle. I thought when he went to the Oval Office a few weeks ago and gave Trump that little newspaper replica, that was a stroke of genius, because we all know how much Trump loves his little trinkets. And
Yeah.
so I thought that was a pretty good stroke of genius. And so he seems to thread the needle fairly well as far as, balancing different constituencies and different needs. And it served us well. So thus far, I thought January 1st at 2 o'clock, the National Guard would be here. I thought they would be here, and I thought we would go through what Minneapolis essentially went through. But I think it speaks to his political skill that it hasn't come to that, thank God.
Yeah. I mean, it's been really interesting to watch.
Yeah. And I when I saw that little trinket newspaper, I was like, wow, he really has him down pat. That psychological profile is just ace.
Yeah, I can't imagine an instance where you had two seemingly politically diametrically opposed individuals calling each other like a fascist and a communist,
Yes.
and then being happy about it and smiling. Like it was really a study in psychology and sociology and strategic manipulation. I mean, it really was fascinating to me. The mayor, for all the things that I might disagree with him on or agree with him on, he is a master politician, and he's a master of the soft skills that are necessary to really moving people with leadership. One of the things I didn't mention is that the elected officials on the South Shore are doing what they should be doing, right? They should be sort of listening and learning and leading. Sometimes, though, leaders take the opposite viewpoint and try to teach and educate their constituencies to come along. And there was an instance out in the Bronx a few years ago where a council member, a Democratic council member, had gone out on a limb supporting a new housing project, affordable housing project in a community in the Bronx. And again, the council member's name escapes me, and I don't remember what the community was, but the case was really interesting because she went out on a limb and took a leap of faith that this project was going to be good for her community, counter to all those community folks with their NIMBY issues. She lost re-election. The Republican won. 2 years later, the Republican lost in 2025 and was replaced by another Democrat. But it was a really interesting case of where an elected official went out to try and lead and bring her constituency with her, and she was unsuccessful in doing it. So maybe it's very possible that the folks down on the South Shore saw that and said, "Hey, you
Oh
know,
yeah, it's a total calculated move. Like I said,
yeah,
about Cliff and for certainly the others, I think this was raw politics. I think,
yeah,
they know that the bread is buttered in that district with NIMBY, and they know that if they came out and said, oh, well, maybe it should go here, or maybe there's another approach, or if they appeared to be waffling in some way, I think it would be political suicide for them, and they
mm,
know it. I guess this is not a time where we could always hope for moral courage at all points, but I was hoping, at least we would get somebody to say, well, maybe the rhetoric around this could be toned down. Maybe the rhetoric around this could be more, responsible and couldn't, not divulge into this oftentimes volatile racism, which we see
mm,
around these things.
yeah. Well, we hope springs eternal, right? Maybe
Yeah, yeah. Well, and well, on that note, you wanted to talk about swamps now, which is a really amazing transition.
swamps. Yeah, so there's two issues. So I'm a parky by training. I served in the Bloomberg administration and partly in the De Blasio administration for New York City Parks, and so I served here in Staten Island for 4.5 years as the chief of staff, and so all things parks all the time for me, even though I'm no longer in that realm. But I don't know how much you know about this, but the Silver Lake Park Road issue continues to
Yes.
percolate. So just for your listeners and viewers, just a little bit of a recitation of the facts that
Mhm.
during the de Blasio administration, during the pandemic, there were key roadways in 5 boroughs that were closed as part of like this open streets experiment. And they were literally closed by a mayoral executive order, and they remained closed beyond the pandemic. And a few years ago, probably last year or early
Last year.
last
Last
yeah.
year, yeah.
The Adams administration reopened Silver Lake Park Road. Now, uh, the opposition to that was that the road was being used for recreational purposes. It was closed 7 days a week. Prior to that, it had been open during the week and then closed on the weekends. And so the decision to do that was based on an appeal by the district attorney and the council member saying, and it was in response to a rape that had occurred in Silver Lake Park a few weeks before that. So there's a number of folks in the community, it's probably a few hundred of us who have come together and appealed to the Adams administration at the time to reopen the road. And so the compromise that they offered, they didn't really offer. They kind of told us, voluntold us, as they
Yes.
say, that the road would be open during the week and then closed at 5 p.m. on Friday and opened up Monday morning for the daily commute. And so, with the new administration coming in, we have made an appeal to the Mamdani administration to reconsider. And the reasons why. And so, like, I've had, I have neighbors that love to take that shortcut in the morning.
I
I have
do too.
neighbors that,
Full disclosure, I do too.
okay,
I do
no,
too.
look, everyone loves a little windy road through a park, right? But subsequent to it being open, DOT actually put in speed bumps and
Mhm.
they've made it less, I think it's less enjoyable now. The speed limit's 20 miles an hour or 15 miles an hour. So, and actually, the funny thing is, if you go on Google Maps, it's not a shortcut. It's actually pretty much a triangle that the same distance, if you go up Forest and make a right onto Victory, is the same distance as the roadway. So it's sort of like an optical illusion of sorts. But let me give you the reasons why this group is continuing to talk about this issue. One, there was no community input or feedback. So very much like the issue with the homeless facility on the South Shore, people are upset that there was no engagement. Okay, so that's a similar concern. The number of crashes that had happened on that road were pretty significant. There was, I think, 38 crashes within a 3-year period between 2012 and 2015 when it was last open to traffic. Since it's been opened, so that's 15 crashes over 3 years. Since it's been open for the last less than 9 months, there have been 4 people injured already in the park because of cars. So bad things are happening. One of the arguments that were made was that cars make parks safer. And it's actually the opposite. Cars do not make parks safer, they make them more dangerous because they're just sort of they don't really work well together. It's evidenced by closing the roadways in Central Park and Prospect Park because the city realized that it just doesn't work. Um, I don't want to kill you with stats and stuff, but the other argument was that the park is not as safe unless there are cars in it. And actually, in Staten Island, 99.7% of crimes take place in a place other than a New York City park. Outside of that park space, there are very few protected areas for people to ride their bikes, ride their scooters, to play ball, to run then that roadway, that Silver Lake Park roadway was a new recreational amenity on a section of the island that has very little open recreation space. We have Silver Lake Park, we have Clover Lake Parks, but you can't ride a bike on any of those parks. You're not allowed to ride on the pathways because park bikes and pedestrians don't mix. And here was a 1.5 mile stretch of roadway where people were actually able to use it in a way that they could never use the park before. Lastly, the biggest argument is that those cars have now forced folks into the park, and the pathways are both unsafe and very often not ADA accessible. They're not paved correctly, they're not crowned correctly, meaning that the water doesn't shed, so you get puddles. So, there's a lot of reasons why it needs to be reconsidered. Now, whether that argument wins the day, we don't know. We're waiting for the Mamdani administration to weigh in. But there is a bigger push to start to reconsider these inter-park roadways as being amenities as opposed to just pass-throughs for vehicles.
Well, I was going to ask about that. Have you heard anything from the Mamdani administration? Because I just know, just from my limited knowledge of the inside baseball
Mhm.
around the way that city government works, uh, Councilwoman Hanks, who's the councilwoman whose district this is in,
Mhm.
she is supportive of it being open, this road. And so my uh, instinct is to say that he probably will not, because usually they don't when it comes to super local things like this that the council members are particularly passionate about. They don't usually override them, or am I wrong about that?
I don't know. I don't know how that's going to play out. In the past, the city council had like was local council member priority, so that if a council member weighed in on a land use issue or a siting issue, things that landmarking issue, they usually went to the local council member who theoretically would know the issue best, and they would go with the preference of the local council member. That sort of eroded under the Eric Adams administration. There was a lot of sort of disregard for local council member input, which, I don't know if that's good or bad. I would tend to, having worked in the city council, working for a council member, I would prefer local council member voices to be heard. In this instant, I'm not sure. I really don't know what's going on internally, but all we've been told is that they're thinking about it. And just getting that is better than what we were before. Being told that someone's thinking about something is a step forward, and it opens up possibilities again.
Well, I was going to ask you, and you don't have to tell me on the record, but there's this hilarious satirical Instagram around that issue.
Yeah.
It was like, this sense of humor reeks of Mike Schnall. Is that you?
No, it's not me. I have my suspicions on who it is.
Okay.
They're heavily reliant on AI. They
Yes,
do have
I do. I have seen that, and I was like, well, and I remember somebody like took it literally. They were like, oh, they're literally saying to race and stuff in the park, and
yeah.
I was like, but it's clearly a joke. I mean, come on.
Yeah, I think they took it a little too far recently. There was some post that they put up that really upset the council member because it actually like people could have followed the directives in that AI
How
generated
did
post, and
like,
it is very funny. I mean, I think that the
yeah. Oh,
sense of
it's
irony is not
hilarious.
not
Yeah.
lost on us.
It's hilarious. Well, I mean, if I was thinking like if anybody was going to follow that, that's like the same people who eat the fucking Tide Pods, the Tide Pods. Like, who
Or
was
follow their GPS into a lake. right?
Yeah, like who would do that? But like I and so but it was funny. It was funny. And you would showed me this article about how one of our green spaces became gross. It looks like Nickelodeon slime. How did that happen?
Yeah. Yeah, so according to the article, it sounds like there is a number of toilets or restrooms in a park staffed facility that are going directly into the creek in Clove Lake Park. So based on the article alone, it sounds pretty gross.
It is. Oh, I read it earlier. It is gross.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. Like there's a lot of things, there's a lot to go to talk about there that we just don't know about yet. You know, the questions of who knew, who should have done something, those I don't know the facts of what actually happened. But I will say that it is sort of the canary in a coal mine type of issue on a larger sense of the underfunding of New York parks. And it goes back to, the 1% for Parks campaign by New Yorkers for Parks, calling on the de Blasio administration and then the Eric Adams administration, now the Zoran Mamdani administration, to just bring parks up to 1% of the budget, which would be probably on the order of less than a billion dollars total. I think it's like nine something. But it goes to show that when city agencies don't have the necessary resources to do things, things don't get done. And when they don't get done, bad things happen. And, I think it's one of many opportunities for us as voters to engage now with the existing class of elected officials and then the next wave that are going to run in 2029 to talk about how quintessentially important parks are to Staten Islanders and to New Yorkers. I mean, if you remember during the pandemic, like everyone was in their park. That was
Mhm.
the only safe space. And we've seemed to have forgotten how important those were for our everyday survival back then and even now. I mean, it literally is a solution for mental health issues. People go to parks, they get some peace and quiet, they get some exercise, they spend time with their friends and family, and yet we don't fund them to a point where they're actually safe and clean. And this article is kind of like a really gross example of that sort
Yeah.
of
I'll
benign neglect.
I'll put it in our show notes for folks if they really, if they want if they want grosser news from what's already out there, but not as like, end of the world, then they could read that. But
Yeah.
I was appalled just by the imagery and just, ugh, it was gross.
Yeah. Really,
And
really kind of gross.
yeah, well, you brought up a good point about, and this will be the final thing we touch upon, but
Sure.
we there's been a standoff budget-wise between the council and the mayor.
Mhm.
Um, the mayor has said, if Albany doesn't raise taxes, we're going to have to raise property taxes and to fill the budget gap. And the council has basically said, no, we're not going to do that. They actually put
Mhm.
their proposal forward, which doesn't raise property taxes. And I think the mayor is using this as a negotiation tactic so that Albany raises taxes on the wealthy, on the 1%. Now, as a policy goal long term, I'm absolutely for that. I think we absolutely have to be taxing these people because it's clear they don't pay their fair share in a whole lot of ways. And oftentimes their threats to leave New York ring hollow. They don't leave.
Mhm.
And so, but I just think that, from what I've been told from sources in Albany, that's dead on arrival. Nobody wants to be the person in an election year to say, be on the receiving end of the so and so raised taxes. Nobody wants to have that ad out there in an election year. And so, how do you think this all ends?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting strategy. I mean, yeah, I as a homeowner, I thought about how um, it's not 9.5% of an increase. It's actually much more than that when you look at how the calculations are done. So it would have had an incredible impact on homeowners. Additionally, what I found really unusual about the proposal was that it actually would impact renters too, and that's been a constituency he's been talking to for a while now about lowering or freezing the rent. And so, the way that in which that would impact them was that the landlord would pass the tax increase off to their renters. So I thought that that was really strange. I'm glad to hear that it sounds like he said that it's not going to happen. I mean, it would really be very negatively impactful, particularly in Staten Island, where 60% of us are homeowners and the other 40% rent. So it would really have a disproportionate effect on Staten Island. What I think is going to happen is that Albany is going to find more funding and they're going to try to help out. And I think that that's really the only way to do it. New York City, I think, gives more than it gets. I think it's something like we get back only 60 something percent of the tax money that we provide. Now, folks have asked, like, why don't we just hold back some of the funding that we give to Albany? And that can't happen. But what can happen is that our reps in Albany, our state assembly members and our state senators can try to get more money for us. And I think that we need that. But long term, it sounds like it's an interesting thing. I've been involved in municipal government for 25 years. I worked at the city council. I worked in a mayoral administration. So I've been involved in that budget dance. And I've never really seen a mayor react the way he has, so quickly and so like uh, not negatively, but just he took it very personal, it seemed like. The interesting thing is that they both have really good ideas in their budget proposals. And
Yeah.
if you were to mash the two together, you'll solve the budget problem that we have for this year. Now, I don't know how that'll go for the next year and the year forward, but I suspect that the reason why he reacted that way is because everyone has known on day one that the speaker has always had a desire to run for mayor. And very often, you've seen speakers that have had a desire to run for mayor use their budget response as a way to sort of stick it to their potential opponent. And I
Mhm.
think that that's what he's reacting to, is that he sees the writing on the wall that the speaker is eventually going to run against him in 3.5 years and is trying to, distance himself from what it is that she's saying and what he's saying, and so that it puts some space between the two of them.
That's interesting that you say that. I always thought she was, if she wanted to be, she was a credible challenger to him if she does. But, the problem is that she's running against history. No speaker has ever done it. And even though they've tried, and, some, like Quinn, who I worked for, it seemed like it was a shoo-in, but, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting thing. I thought maybe that he reacted personally to also to Hochul, basically writing off property the tax hikes because she's very much tied herself to him in recent months, and he's basically I think he probably feels like, well, you're tying yourself to my political success and my vision, and yet you're not doing anything to help bring it about. And
Mm,
so that's also kind of where I am on that. I also think he also put I think he put Jessica Tisch remaining as NYPD commissioner because she's also a potential challenger.
interesting. Yeah, no, I didn't even think about that.
I think he wanted to keep an eye on her, and she could self-fund a campaign. She's got the money to do it.
Yeah. Look, this is a politics is a dirty game, right? And your friend one day could be your enemy the next. Politics makes for strange bedfellows, like we've discussed before. So he's
Oh,
keenly aware that
yeah.
the day he walked into City Hall was the day that he was most popular. That every day since that it gives voters a reason to like or not like him. So his calculations and his reactions are all calculated and based on his, I would assume, reelection. So he's got, some time ahead of him to figure this out. Kathy Hochul is facing reelection in 9 months, 8 months, and is facing a downstate Republican candidate who downstate has a lot more votes than upstate, where she comes from in Buffalo. So she has also figured out what it is she needs to win. And he's part or not part, or Mamdani is part or not part of that calculation. Just like Menon has figured out what it is she needs to do to move the city council forward and to also create some space with her and him so that if she were to run with him, she would have some differentiation. So it's a really fascinating time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And well, it's interesting because, I was saying to people in Mamdani world who were optimistic that his tax hikes would be passed. I was like, nobody's going to vote for that in an election year. Nobody's going to do that. And
Yeah.
she's running for re-election, the governor, in New York, that, Donald Trump improved his performance here enormously 2 years ago. I mean, Kamala Harris only won it by 13 points. And in New York City, his performance was even better. And so I think that, she's running headwinds into that reality, although I think, whatever improvements he made here will just be erased by the fact that his time in office so far has just been a total clusterfuck.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see what Bruce Blakeman is able to do. I mean, from what I have gathered, I've watched sort of some of the polls, that he is slowly inching closer to her. But it remains to be seen, if the fundraising edge that she has helps her overcome whatever, slow creep Blakeman is able to make. You haven't heard much from his campaign right now. I think he's allowing her to do a lot of the talking and figuring that the more she talks, the better it is for him. I think that might be his calculation, or he's just waiting to till after the budget's passed so that he has something to run against.
Well,
We'll
yeah,
see.
and I think he's also kind of been shoved into this because, until Elise Stefanik, said, "Take care,
Right.
see you later."
Right.
Um,
That was surprising. That was very
yeah,
surprising.
when she was like, "See you later," this guy has fucked me over one too many times.
Yeah.
And I even think he was probably like, well, I'm probably going to lose the primary, and she'll be the nominee. But now he's like, well, he's just by default, he's there now. So I think he's just kind of figuring that out.
Yeah, he sort of is the right person at the right time.
Yeah.
It was interesting that if he didn't run, if he didn't announce that he was running, would she still be running? Or did someone figure out that, they needed to get rid of her and it didn't matter that there was someone to slip right into her spot? I don't know. Again,
I think it was just
yeah.
all a matter of circumstance. She was like, this guy fucked me over four times this year, gave me the UN gig, took it away. Needs my because he needs my House vote, then he won't even back me in this primary. So see you later.
Mm,
And I think that's just sort of what it was. I think she made a similar calculation to Marjorie, actually, that this guy's
mm.
just gonna, is out for himself and he's sick and he's just whatever. Take care.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see as we continue on in the year how many more folks decide to retire from Congress because they just don't see a path forward for either their reelection or, his coattails not existing. And
Yeah.
how do they get reelected in that sort of in that space?
Yeah, well, on that cheerful note, it is Taco Tuesday, and this is a thank you, Mike Schnall, for coming on and being my guest co-host on short notice. I
Sure.
appreciate you. I always enjoy your insights and analysis. Like I said, you're one of maybe five or six people locally that I actually care what you think. So,
Thank you. I will now be more careful what I say. No, I appreciate that. I really do. And I should be listening more often to your podcast than I do. I try to catch it every once in a while on my drive to work in the morning. But I think, it's funny. I was thinking about the title of your podcast and it has a double entendre to it. So I
Mhm.
appreciate the sort of like being left out in a
Mhm.
borough and also being left politically. That's
Yes.
pretty smart. And so I keep doing what you guys are doing, and I will definitely share it around as much as I can.
Thank you, Mike Schnall. This is the Left in the Forgotten Borough podcast, and we'll be back later in the week with Nancy.